Welcome to Community Insight, a show about the family well-being movement. I'm your host, Valerie Frost. Over the past several years, this field has been working to shift from a child protection model toward a broader vision of family well-being, one that focuses on prevention, support, and keeping families together whenever possible. But that shift raises a deeper question. What does it actually mean to transform the system we already have? And is that transformation truly possible? Today's guest, Sixto Cancel, is the founder and CEO of Think of Us, an organization working to redesign how systems support young people and families. Sixto also brings lived experience to this work. As a young person, he spent time in foster care. He was abused after he was adopted, only to later find out that extended family members lived nearby the entire time. That experience shapes how he thinks about what systems do, what they miss, and what families actually need. In this conversation, we explore what it would take to transform the current child welfare system into a family well-being system. What would need to change in practice, what challenges stand in the way, and how to think about this moment where both progress and harm exist at the same time. I started by asking Sixto to make the case for why he believes this transformation is possible. So Sixto, you have said that you believe the current child welfare system can and should be transformed into a family well-being system. But not everyone agrees with that. So there are people who believe the system has done too much harm for far too long and that families will never trust it enough for transformation to work. So I want to start there. Make the case. Why do you believe it can and should be that system?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that families are right. Young people are right that this system has done harm, right? And I know that firsthand from entering as a baby and being adopted, it being the wrong adoption, and then being back in foster care and aging out. So the fundamental premise of you are only going to be placed in foster care for a temporary time, and if we can't get you back home, then we'll find you an extension of your forever family. I know what that failure looks like. Now, for me, though, when I'm looking at the system, I'm looking at all the reforms that have been created, executed by folks with lived experience, right? With the folks who have been impacted. And there's something to say that we've had progress. Now, are we at our destination? By no means. But what I do know is that when I look out and I see the revolutions that we've seen in other sectors, such as the telephone, where the smartphone was about adding all of these new features to it, it made the old way almost obsolete. But the foundational infrastructure is still the same, right? But we now use that infrastructure to do something completely different than the infrastructures phones used to have. So what I believe in is not the right now tactical mechanics of a transformation. What I'm believing is that we have enough proof points in this country of people with lived experience and others who are actually shifting the system to be something different.
Can we stay with the infrastructure just for a little bit? We had Erin Cloud on and she said, look, the infrastructure has some sugar in there. Okay. It's a cake. We have a cake with sugar. I don't know if you heard that. She talked about this cake. But she was like, there's just too much salt, right? So we need to start over. So why not start over?
I think there are different approaches to everything. There are some parts of this system where you do want to start over. The idea of starting over with investigations, like you need help and that ends up being a knock on the door. Well, starting over for me means what does it look like to completely reimagine that? And so when I think about the opt-in initiative from Doris Duke, and in that initiative, it's about how birth parents who have been investigated or at risk of being investigated have said, you know what, there's a different way that if we get reported, instead of just being screened out, that nonprofits in the community can be deployed to provide cash and some resource navigation. Well, there's something different. To me, that's a start over from deconstructing a moment in time and constructing something new.
All right. So what I'm hearing from you is there is evidence and there is proof and there are things to work with.
Yes, but a salty cake ain't good. And so the question becomes
Okay.
how much additional cake batter we gonna have to add until the salt levels out.
And I hear you on that. And I want to, you started to mention this. So I do actually want to get a little personal because you're real. You're being real right now, but you're also optimistic, right? So you mentioned your system's involvement. I've heard your TED talk. I heard you at the White House, all this. So you've lived the system and it didn't work for you. So how did you get here? Like, how did you personally get to a place where you still believe in it?
I have to say it's in the progress of what I see, right? Like those of us who choose to stay in the field of child welfare, like we've grown up with the state being our parent, but then we choose to literally continue to do this work for system improvements. Well, what did work for me is that I did have a pathway to college. Why? Because those before me who were advocates with lived experience actually advocated for that to happen. And continuously, we are seeing more and more reforms. One of my favorite reforms that I think is just going to be so impactful is this concept of soul family. The idea that we can take chosen family and legalize that relationship and leave foster care to that legal family without terminating our siblings' rights, without terminating rights of our parents, without not being eligible for the same things that we would have been eligible for if we would have stayed in the system. And so I believe that folks are creating different proof points for how the system should work, that we can do that. Now, what I have a real doubt in is how fast we're going to get there, how painful it's going to be to get there, right? But my optimism is not to negate that the pathway is going to be filled with a whole bunch of difficulty.
All right, so let's talk about the new way then. What are the first real shifts that you would expect to see?
Well, the first thing I want to say, first and foremost, is we have to have child protection, right? We cannot continue to argue whether the new system and new child and family well-being system, how, it's not going to be as rigorous on child protection. We need to keep children safe. So I just want to set the first foundation there. But then there is the reality of like, there are folks that before stuff gets so intense, that we have the opportunity to actually intervene, and that those interventions should come from one's own community. And in my opinion, specifically nonprofits. There is a role for churches too. And so, how is it that we have nonprofit and churches who are involved in delivering some of these interventions, right? And then from there, I also believe if you have to come into the system, the next component is how are we ensuring that that child's immediate family member or a distant family member who they have an attachment with, someone that they know that they're living with a person that they know as they await to return home. And that reunification is resourced in such a way that it is a family intervention, not just a parent compliance journey. And I do believe that, we have to think thoroughly about economic mobility. When we look at the thousand or so parents and caregivers that we serve a year, most of them are making under $40,000 a year. It is hard to be like, we are going to heal, develop, and be positioned to thrive. And we're going to make sure that this child that's in our family is going to be positioned to thrive if you are making $20,000 a year, if you are just in survival mode yourself with you and the family.
All right, so the question was what changes first. So you started to talk about the community level, prevention level, nonprofits and churches stepping in. So do we want to say that financial stability, economic mobility, do we want to say that's the first step? Like we can't do the work
I,
until people have enough money to survive first?
I actually think the first step is really looking at child protection. When I think about our country, it has 74 million children in it, and only 250,000 people are removed. And it is taboo for us to even ask the question, have we actually found enough of the children who have been sexually abused? Are we finding enough of the children who are literally walking around with scars on their body? I have to think that we need to challenge that. Yes, we're doing that. Now, do I believe we're removing too many of the folks who can get other interventions? I do believe that. But I question whether we are finding enough young people who are in need. And is the current investigation process the real process for actually finding and lifting that? Now, I may be biased because I had to literally tape a recorder to my chest as a 13, 14-year-old to collect the abuse I was going through to get back into foster care. But for me, when I look at my colleagues, when I look at my friends, and there's always this notion of, oh, wow, you should have been in foster care too, or oh, wow, someone should have stepped in. I think we're not doing child protection right.
So what would it look like? How would it look different?
That's the thing I struggle with. I can talk to you about what economic mobility can look like. I could talk to you about what prevention can look like. But how do enter a family's life to figure out what abuse looks like? I can tell you small tactical things like when I was questioned by an investigator in front of my adopted parent who was doing the things, when you have the fear of, well, I'm a teenager. If I go into foster care, I'm going to be locked up in a group home. Well, that kept me for so long from actually sharing what was happening. It had to get so bad that I was willing to go to jail. I was willing to go to a group home. I was willing to be shipped out of state. When I got to those places, that's when I actually started to make CPS reports.
All right. So I appreciate your honesty on I may not have the answer here, but I'm making an assumption, so forgive me. But I feel like you do know the answer on how would we find the answer? What would the process look like for that answer to be found?
I definitely think it would start with truly understanding and communicating and gaining trust with the child, with the young person. For me, when I think back to my experiences, so much of that experience was rooted in places where there was always someone listening and not enough clarity of what are all the options. Once you realize that the option doesn't have to be nuclear, then we don't need to get to a nuclear place. Could it have worked out with my adoptive parent? I don't know. She was someone who was abusive. She was racist. She had her views, right? She was outly said those things to people and proud. But there are many families that that's not their story, in that potentially there could have been a different pathway. But if you don't know those different paths as the family and the child, how do we get there?
All right. So again, going back to that, like what was the process be for determining how to reach young people and develop those relationships?
I struggle. I really struggle. The only thing I can think about is who I used to disclose to and how those folks were empowered. I had my dance teacher who, me and the other young people who were in the house, my adopted siblings, that we would share a lot to. But, she also knew what it meant to report. She knew that we weren't ready. Even one time when she did report, we all lied and was like, oh, nothing's happening, right? And so I think there's something about these adults in our lives as children that we do disclose things to. How do we activate them more?
All right. So we agree on the first step here. So first step is we really want to focus on child protection needs to protect children, right? So then we go back to community supports to people that are not in the system. So you talk about the nonprofits and churches. Where would these entities get the resources to support people who are not in the system yet?
Yeah, when I looked at Terry's leadership, and Terry, a woman named Terry, and her number two named David in Indiana, right? What they were able to accomplish by cutting the system in half, I felt was a beginning example, a shining, step forward around what is possible. And what they did is they said, you know what, nonprofits, we are going to finance you to show up for families. And instead of us saying you have to meet these reimbursement clauses and you have to meet these regulations, it was, we're going to give you a per diem per family. And if that family needs a therapist, whether you fly in a therapist from across the country, or you train staff to become therapists, or you find some special recruitment program that you have therapists, I don't know how you're going to do it, but we're going to give you the flexibility to do it. And that type of flexibility for a nonprofit to figure out how to be in service to the people who live in their neighborhood, their streets, their backyard, I do believe brings some space for them to do the job differently. And then I do believe that, if government was to finance the capabilities for that nonprofit to operate with certain capacity and skill sets for the staff, that we would have nonprofits who can deliver different levels of intervention.
All right, so we heard resourcing community. We talked about keeping kids safe. Let's talk now about resourcing family, extended family, kinship. Talk about that. Like, what would that piece look like for the ones that have extra needs beyond the nonprofits and churches?
So there's definitely material needs, and we all know that. Someone knocks on your door at the middle of the night and you have limited clothes or no clothes for the children who are being dropped off at your doorstep. Obviously, we need to just do that. They're common sense things. So I won't even get into all the common sense kind of things that we need to do to make sure that a family member can step in. The thing that I think is ignored is healing. What does it look like when you have to step in and take responsibility for your siblings or for another family member's children? And now your life is on a different track, right? We talk about kinship and we talk about, oh my God, like, we need to make sure that we find someone who steps in to take your relative's child. But there's a loss there for the person who's like, I have to do this now, right? And so, what does healing look like between the relationship between that family member who steps up and the person's children they're caring for? What does healing look like when they realize their family member's child has been potentially being abused or severely neglected? And so, I think we have to do more to, take what some folks might call this fluffy word of healing and be much more intentional about what it looks like to have that relational repair, and what does the relationship and boundary look like during that situation.
So I'm pairing it back to you now. Components of the way forward, the new way, resourcing communities, resourcing family and extended family, and keeping kids safe. Anything that you want to add to that?
The economic mobility is critical. Milk costs more, eggs cost more, clothes. The reality of what it takes to survive today is continuously increasing and it's becoming harder. And so when I think about, well, what brings healing, what brings the ability to develop and positions you to really thrive beyond self sufficiency, is the ability to have more skills. And people want to be able to contribute to their country, to their community, and to their families. And so, how is it that we are able to pipeline some of these opportunities to upskill to the very folks who are uniquely wired to survive? Our new economy with AI, with technology being at the center of it, and the revolutions that we're seeing require people who are analytical, who are thinking outside of the box, and who are testing and experimenting. Those are some of the top traits that you are hearing from the new industries. And who has that? Better than Fall Street, who have to figure out how to get a bureaucratic process to get reimbursed for a calculator that they might need for school, right? Who has that than a birth parent who's had to navigate the courts and compliance and, take 3 buses to do X, Y, and Z just so that they can get their children back, right? So I think we have a unique group of people in our country who are more positioned than traditional A+ students to say they've been through enough life experiences that they know how to actually adapt to the use of the emerging technologies, the emergent industries that are coming.
Okay. So you talk about the opportunities that can come with AI and upskilling. What are some of the risks here?
I think we're going to leave a whole group of people behind. And that's just the reality, right? What we're seeing with AI is that it is transforming the entry level jobs that were the jobs that people were going to. So this gap between you are freshly trained and early in your career to you are now mid to late, mid to more seasoned career. Well, there's a whole gap there. What does it actually look like to learn and to be able to make those mistakes? And so I fear for what that gap is. I'm excited though that the model of apprenticeships, I believe, are coming back. The idea of learning hands-on by shadowing and doing on some of the trades that we take for granted today, plumbing, electricians, and so forth. Well, those are the trades of the future that people are going to be. There's going to be a scarcity around.
All right. So, we're thinking about the opportunities in the moment. We're thinking about the new way. Obviously, that's not here yet. We're working toward that. talking about and looking at the present, like right now, there are both harmful things happening and meaningful progress happening at the same time. So that can be kind of confusing for people. Like, how should people make sense of this moment?
Well, I'll say the one system, and it's because I love systems reform, is child welfare. Even if I was not someone who was working in child welfare, the reality is that we are living in a moment where people across the entire spectrum of local advocates, folks with lived experience, all the way down, or should I say, all the way to Capitol Hill, the federal agency and the White House, who are all looking at how do we make this one system better. What we're really talking about is a bunch of different actors who are trying to make it so that our children have an actual system that if something bad happens, this is the system that should help you heal, develop, and be positioned to thrive way beyond self-sufficiency. Now, we all have different ways that we believe we should get there. That is not a question. And some of us are going to be right and some of us are just going to be wrong on that journey. However, what encourages me is that out of the different systems that I'm looking at progress, that we are actually having progress on people having dialogue, on people funding and doing different proof points in communities, that the ideas are ranging from coming at its genesis of a nonprofit, a person with lived experience, a person in Congress, a person in a federal agency. So we see a bubbling of different ideologies, different ideas, different people's opinion, and then action towards it. When you have those type of ingredients, you're talking about a movement in the making.
Okay, so let's talk about this movement. Let's talk about progress. Let's talk about proof. Like, if the new way works and we get to this well being system, what is one thing that has to change first for families to actually feel it?
It's that first interaction that a family has with a system. The thing that you said earlier, and that people really do have, their thumb on the right pulse here is that, there's coercion by the very presence,
Yeah.
right? And so if we're starting with that fear, then you can't go far with actually positioning someone to heal or to develop, right? To be able to meet the needs of their children. Now, what I do believe is that we have also heard from birth parents in our work that who shows up matters. I think of Fresno County and I think of cultural brokers and the idea that someone who has been through an investigation is out with an investigator and literally being a advocate and a coach and a resource navigator to say, you know what, maybe this knock on the door from the investigator wasn't the right response, but I'm here to work as a team to get you as the cultural broker to the intervention that you truly need and that serves you and your family. And I think that is an example of one of the first things that need to happen, which is real folks who have real empathy, who have real lived experience and other adjacent proximity to be able to be in service to the folks that this system is trying to help.
Okay, so I'm gonna sum up the new way, the components in with a different language. Tell me if this resonates with you. So what I've heard today, we need the right person, the right tools, so resources, and the right focus, healing.
I love it. I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna run with it.
Use it. Go ahead. Right person, impacted people, people who have walked in the shoes, a family member, extended family member, a community person that you have a relationship with. So we need the right person, the right tools. We need resources. We need, government needs to fund these nonprofits and churches. And we also need the right pathways, right? Those economic, that upskilling, all of that. So we'll add that too, right pathways. Okay.
Yes, and one of the things that we're doing here, I think of us, is trying to ensure that we don't define it. We do not believe that if one organization defines what this is, then we failed, right? This is a moment where the sector needs to come around and say, here are the components we believe to be true. And it doesn't mean we all have consensus, but all in the right direction of like, overwhelmingly, we believe children should live with someone that they already know and love, who has an attachment. Okay, great. Now, some of us believe we should make that an expedited process. Some folks believe that they should go through through a very rigorous process. So I think we all will have opinions about how we'll get there. But what I would love to see from the sector is how we continue to co-design the definition of the new system. And some of us will call it family well-being system, child and family well-being system. But what is true is that we need a new system.
Can we stay there just for a moment, because there's words that go around a lot, and I want to make sure that it has meaning for all the listeners, that they don't just hear the word, start reusing it, and don't really, they don't feel it, and they don't know in application what it means. So you talk about co-designing. What does that mean to Think of Us? What does that process look like?
So for us, we've done things like cast a wide net around what people's opinions are about a particular topic, right? When we got the phone call for one of the commissioners that we worked with in a previous administration to have young people come and give recommendations, we had said, well, they've already given so many recommendations, right? But how can they co design some of the priorities going forward? Well, what did it take? It took 20 ambassadors, right? So young people who were listening to current and former foster youth, who were being trained on what the federal government can do and not do. But we did an open call where 200 ideas from the field were crowdsourced. We were able to go ahead and have those young people do a lit review on just the regular research, but also a unique literature review on all of the different publications from other people with lived experience around recommendations. So they looked at CCAI's proposals where every summer you have foster youth interns who come to Capitol Hill and create a bill for the last 5 years. So co-designing came from crowdsourcing. It came from active listening. It came from people saying, I have a story, but I'm not going to center my story in the recommendations that I am going to provide. I have that lens so that I could understand the young people today who are in care and telling me about what they're going through. Or when I read 20 proposals from the last 5 years on the same topic from lived experience folks, I know what lens I can look at that information through.
All right. So I'm hearing a lot of valuing multiple perspectives, and also elevating lived experience. That has been a thread throughout a lot of what you've shared. So, you all are doing a lot of things, and you talk about building up ambassadors. You talk about wanting to support with the upskilling. I mean, there's so many different things that you all are doing. So I do have kind of a direct question on that. So Sixto, Think of Us, it is kind of a one-on-one right now, right? Like a founder-led organization built from lived experience at scale. So if we believe that this work needs to exist across the country, what would it actually take to make this one of 100? Like, even more personally, like, what would it take for someone like me to build one?
There's so much of this work that's relational. So, number one of the things that we've been doing is the very fellowships that I've been in that are outside of child welfare, that are in the tech space, that are in the systems change space outside of child welfare. Myself and others in the organizations, we've been referring people. We've been using our network to say more of us need to be in different spaces, because what makes Think of Us unique is that we can do tech and data because we went to Silicon Valley and we learned those skills, right? I've been in those trainings. And so there's nothing really special, I would say, about some of the skill sets that I have here, besides that I got to actually get trained outside of child welfare. And now I get to bring those in. And so how do we continue to do that? The second thing I would say is that we have to trust that we can wrap around young leaders and provide them with enough risk capital to lean in and do. I was fortunate enough that Youth Catalytics was going to be our fiscal sponsor. And so I'm a big, big, big believer that young people should get a fiscal sponsorship, not try to start the nonprofit immediately, but start doing the work. And the work in between panels, the work in between a speaking engagement, really understand what that work is, so that then you can understand, okay, how am I going to get clear about my calling to be able to have an impact?
All right. So would you say that the capital and the skills transfer could be what's stopping more founder-led organizations from existing?
I absolutely believe that, but I also believe that the sector actually is structured in such a way where it turns folks with lived experience sometimes into being very competitive. You have your story, and you can share your story. But when you get too old or your story has been shared too many times, then you become a little bit irrelevant. And what we've seen is that you start hitting 30, and then if you haven't developed those other skill sets, then what happens to you? Well, you don't get the callbacks anymore. And you see a group of folks who have lived experience hit that age, and they no longer are embedded in the community, and they lose so much of what has happened. That was one of my greatest fears. So I made a decision early on when I saw that happening to people that I admired, that I was going to develop other skill sets to ensure that like I had a lasting contribution, and that I felt like I had something I can lean on and have meaning. We need to be able to have more pathways than just policy for folks with lived experience. It is powerful to do the work you're doing around narrative shifting and being able to actually bring out insights from people. It is powerful when we have lived experience folks who go work in corporate America. The spectrum of what needs to be developed for our system is vast, and how those folks are then positioned, if they want to contribute back to the movement. We need to have that spectrum of opportunity that goes beyond just sharing stories or just policy advocacy.
All right, sounds great. So I want to go back because the crux of this episode was really reforming the system. So if someone is listening and they're still kind of holding on to that skepticism of, look, there's too much salt in the cake, right? So they're still unsure. They don't know if this is realistic. The proof isn't convincing them. What do you most want them to understand before they dismiss this?
That in the civil rights movement, we needed everybody. When you think about the March on Selma, you had folks who were trained to be on the front lines, and they knew that they were going to get hurt. Some folks in their training was like, oh, hell no, this is not for me. I'm not going to do this. Some folks knew from the beginning they were not going to be part of that, but they were going to write a check. They were going to be at the courthouse ready to bail somebody out. They were going to help with logistics. We all have our role. So just because you don't believe that this is part of the solution doesn't mean it needs to be villainized. It doesn't mean it's not valid. And it doesn't mean that your approach is not valid. I think we need a spectrum of different ideologies, a spectrum of different people thinking about it, so that we actually have a movement. Because if we become monolithic, we do not have a movement. So I applaud the folks who are like, hey, they have this extreme view about like, we're going to have to start this from scratch. Okay. I applaud the folks who are like, we need to have a very practical, incremental, methodical, surgical, step by step. And it may take us 20 years, right? Because none of these are the answer. But how we all collectively go back and forth, just like we saw in the civil rights movement, to push it forward is the way to go. Because at one point, the civil rights movement was also this very spectacle thing for many Americans to say, hey, I don't know if we'll ever get to a new place. And when we look at the literature, who was a big group of people who could have taken action? They call them the Southern moderates. These were folks who are like, I don't believe we should be doing this, but I don't believe, it's going to really, really change. And I'm not willing to risk my own social capital. I'm not willing to risk my own social assets to have this change go forward. And those are the folks who I would say had more harm on the movement, because their inaction made it so that there wasn't movement overall, or very limited movement, should I say.
All right. So, Sixto, this conversation sits inside a much bigger question that the field is still working through. Not just what a family well-being system could look like, but whether the system we already have can actually become that, or whether its history, structure, and logic make that impossible. So what you're arguing is that transformation is not just necessary, but it's possible. And whether people agree with that or not, this episode asks us to take that argument seriously, stress test it, and think more concretely about what families would actually need to feel the difference. And maybe the question underneath all of this isn't just what kind of system we want, but who gets to build it and what it would take to make more of that kind of leadership possible. So, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insight, and for all the work that you do and Think of Us does.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the work that you do. There's nothing more powerful than giving voice to the different contentious topics that really do need to be unpacked.
That was my conversation with Sixto Cancel. This episode sits inside a larger question the field is still working through. Not just what a family well-being system could look like, but whether the system we have today can actually become that. It also raises a deeper question about leadership. Who gets to shape these systems? And what would it take to make more lived experience-led organizations possible? Be sure to follow the podcast for new episodes. You can also rate and review the show on your favorite podcast platform and share it with others interested in the future of family well-being. We thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation for their continued support of the show. And thanks to our sponsor, Sunlight. Sunlight connects families and professionals in the child welfare system with innovative technology tools that improve communication, protection, trust, and transparency for better outcomes. Community Insight is produced in partnership with Imagination Factory and 14th Street Studios. Thanks to Matt Anderson, Tavon Lewis, Michael Osborne, and Morgan Honecker. The opinions and conclusions expressed in the podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Annie E. Casey Foundation.